mail-in voting, mail-in ballots for voting.
I think mail-in voting is horrible.
You voted by mail
corrupt.
in Florida's election last month, didn't you?
Sure, I could vote by mail for that.
How do you reconcile
Because I'm
that?
allowed to. Well, that's called out of state. You know why I voted? Because I happen to be in the White House and I won't be able to go to Florida to vote.
But let me just say,
well, there's a big difference between somebody that's out of state and does a ballot and everything's sealed, certified, and everything else. You see what you have to do with the certifications. And you get thousands and thousands of people sitting in somebody's living room signing ballots all over the place. No, I think that mail-in voting is a terrible thing. I think if you vote, you should go. And even the concept of early voting is not the greatest because a lot of things happen. But it's okay. But you should go and you should vote. I think you should go and you should vote. You look at what they do where they grab thousands of mail-in ballots and they dump it. I'll tell you what, and I don't have to tell you, you can look at the statistics. There's a lot of dishonesty going along with mail-in voting, mail-in ballots.
Okay, so for those keeping score, absentee voting is bad and everyone should be voting in person at the polls unless you're the President of the United States and voting absentee, in which case it's good and should be allowed, which I'll admit is pretty convenient if you're Donald Trump. This answer came after a series of questions in which Trump played dumb and pretended not to understand what the issue was with forcing Wisconsin voters to go to the polls despite the small matter of, you know, a deadly virus sweeping the nation.
There's voting going on today in Wisconsin. There are reports of thousands of people waiting in hours-long lines as they've had to weigh their own personal health and their civic responsibility. Do you think that the Supreme Court was right in its decision that voting should go forward, the absentee extension should not take place?
Yeah. Look, the Supreme Court, of course they were right, because what the Democrats wanted, and you know what this happened, I supported a man named Justice Kelly, who's Daniel Kelly, highly respected justice. And I supported him just the other day, social media. I know of him. He's just a fantastic justice, and I endorsed him. And as soon as I endorsed him, they wanted to move the election. They didn't want to move the election. As soon as I endorsed him, the Wisconsin Democrats say, "Oh, let's move the election to 2 months later." They didn't mind having the election until I endorsed him, which is very interesting. And now they talk about, oh, safety, safety. Well, it was 15 minutes after I put out an endorsement that they said we have to move the election. They didn't want to move the election before that. The other thing they wanted to do, which is crazy, at the end of the election, they wanted to have 1 week for proxies to come in or mail ballots. Now, mail ballots, they cheat, okay? People cheat. Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters.
The voting in Wisconsin and those long lines, who will be responsible and who should be held responsible if people get sick after they voted?
Look, all I did was endorse a candidate. I don't know anything about their lines. I don't know anything about their voting. I love the state.
But you also encourage people to get out and vote today as well. Will you take some of the responsibility if some of those people
I won the
get sick?
state, which is rare for a Republican to do, but I won the state of Wisconsin. I'm going to win it again because we've been great to the people of Wisconsin, as you know, with our policies, and they like me and I like them. But all I did was endorse a candidate that's highly qualified, very respected person. And all hell broke loose as soon as I did that. And then all of a sudden they want to change. Before I endorsed them, they didn't want to change this voting area. There was no problem with the Democrats voting until I endorsed the candidate. Then they said, let's move it 2 months. Let's move it 3 months later. Safety, 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 right? All of a sudden they want safety.
Now, here's why Trump is playing dumb. He wants there to be voting in Wisconsin because what's happening in that state is the culmination of years of efforts by state Republicans to make voting harder and to gerrymander legislative districts and to dilute the power of the state's urban center, which traditionally votes Democratic. And those efforts would be cemented with the election of another conservative justice to the state Supreme Court, which is where any challenges to these undemocratic voter suppression efforts would be adjudicated. Which is why Republicans are hell-bent on tilting the scales as much as they can in favor of conservative incumbent Justice Daniel Kelly over his liberal challenger, Joe Karofsky. And they're doing exactly that by having closed all but 5 polling places in Milwaukee, the urban center of the entire state. In other words, There are 5 polling places for 600,000 people, and that's by design. Because while fewer polling places in rural areas, which typically vote Republican, won't necessarily have much of a material impact, having the entire population of Milwaukee vote in only a few spots means that we'll be looking at 3, 4, 5-hour waits to vote, and on top of that, while sacrificing their health to do it. We shouldn't have any in-person voting. We are in the midst of the worst global pandemic in our lifetimes. The last thing that any elected official should be endorsing is sending people to congregate in long lines for hours on end in public. To force the citizens of a state to choose between their fundamental right to vote and their health is an abdication of their humanity, to say nothing of their job as elected officials. Now, Trump claims that all of this sprung up as the result of his endorsement of Justice Kelly, which is exactly the amount of narcissism you'd expect from the guy who has, thus far, managed to make this entire pandemic about himself. He claims that Democrats only discovered the idea of mail-in voting once he tweeted his endorsement, which is absurd. Democrats tried to ensure that the vote-by-mail legislation that was championed by Democratic Senators Wyden and Klobuchar be included in the bailout bill, but it was a non-starter in the Republican-led Senate. So to claim that Democrats only started pushing this legislation when Trump tweeted some endorsement is just some self-important fever dream by the president. Trump also touts this idea that mail-in ballots are rife with fraud. Of course, this president has had a tenuous relationship at best with these kinds of claims. He created a voter fraud commission to try and justify his claim that there were 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrants voting in the 2016 election, which the commission couldn't find before being forced to disband. Trump claimed that he only lost New Hampshire because out-of-staters drove in and cast ballots. He said Republicans lost the 2018 midterms because after voting, some people would, quote, go to their car, put on a different hat, put on a different shirt, come in and vote again. Although I should mention that in recent memory, there has been one notable instance of election fraud. It was perpetuated by a Republican operative to try and steal the election in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. So weird how Trump failed to mention that in the one rare instance of credible fraud, it was his own party that was at the helm. And look, clearly this isn't about voter fraud, it's about voter suppression. It's about a major political party in the so-called greatest democracy in the world exploiting a pandemic to win. So when Trump says that mail-in voting is bad, it is, per usual, to help himself. It is undemocratic and baseless, and coming from someone who himself just submitted an absentee ballot, is hypocritical above all.